name is John O'Sullivan, and I'm very happy to be here. I really appreciate the warm welcome. I just came up to Connecticut from North Carolina, and this morning, it's gotten to 27. When I got up, it was 21. So a warm welcome, obviously, is all I appreciate it, let me say, from North Carolina. But I'm originally from here in Orange, and grew up here, and it's a wonderful place. It was really a great place to be a kid. I'm 77 years old, born in 1944, and name is O'Sullivan, and O'Sullivan's in Orange go back to 1924. But Dad and Mom had an apartment down on the Derby Avenue, New Haven Avenue, down in Derby, right opposite Mount St. Peter's cemetery there. And I was born, and my first 4 years were there, just at the time as they were redoing the turnpike, the Route 34. Right in front of we were on the second floor of an apartment there, and the big equipment was taking out the trolley tracks, putting in the lane that was over on this side. And it was a great place to be as a little kid, you know. It was great there. And I don't know if you can see my damaged forehead. You probably can't. But one afternoon with my elder brother, Jeff, we were sledding over in the cemetery, and I managed to hit a tombstone and get a nice gash in my head. They had to take me up to the hospital. So growing up in Derby has its pros and cons. And we were very happy to move, and I just don't recommend anybody, little kids especially, sledding in cemeteries. But it was a great place to sled, let me just say. And we moved here in 1948. My grandfather on my mother's side, those are the Hessians. William Hessian is also an Irish name, oddly enough, from up in north central Ireland. And he and his sons had a construction company, and they built a house at 954 Orange Center Road, right at the corner of Route 34 in Orange Center, with the Racebrook Country Club right across the street. And what's that, Green Hill Acres across the way was just pastures. When we moved there, Mr. Woodruff had his farm on the other side of that where the trees were, and there was the water tower with the windmill, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful place to come to. We were on that corner, and the Hessian brothers built a cinder block house, normal for those days, I suppose. But as it turned out, with my brothers born here and my elder brother, Jeff, there were 5 kids and mother and dad in a 3-bedroom house with 1 toilet and a kitchen, you know, and a little mud room, which we needed because we moved in December of 1948, and we really needed a mud room because that's what was around the house there, and white cinder block. Now it's a kind of a bronze color, I'd say. It's beautiful. Dad did a nice job on rehabbing it or making it more beautiful late in his life. But anyhow, we moved in there, and that was my brother Jeff, myself. I was 4. Kathy was born in 1946. So there were the 3 kids and mother and dad. Dad was a lawyer for the New Haven Railroad, and so he would walk down to the end of the street and get the green bus. What was that? CPL? No, it was the blue buses with the Connecticut, and the Connecticut Light and Power, CLP. They had buses running up to the valley, and Dad had a pass because the companies were owned by the railroad. So he'd take a bus into work. He'd come back, and our great joy was sitting there's a big picture window there, and we could see him get off the bus and come up the driveway there next to Dr. Conti's. And he'd stop at Mary Oliver's chocolates right there, because that's where he had to switch the buses coming up from the railroad and get the bus out here. And he'd buy a little bag of chocolates, or sometimes licorice nibs, and they'd be down in the bag. So he'd put his briefcase down, take off his coat and his hat, the way men dressed in those days, and we'd be digging in and getting our candy hit, just what we needed right before dinner. But anyhow, it was we grew up there, and if you know that corner, right behind that area are 3 large white houses. House in the center was our grandfather's house, and that's where the O'Sullivans moved to in 1925. He had the house built in 23, 24 with Bill Healy, who's next door on the, if you're standing looking at the houses, it would be on the left. The house on the right was built by the builder of the houses, Shaughnessy, I think his name was. There's a big S on the big white chimney, you know, and I don't remember, it's a big metal one. I don't know if it's still there. They weren't there when we came up there. The Nelsons lived there, and he was a gun salesman for Winchester and the guns here, and he would go off around the world with crates of guns. I don't know if this is a good thing to tell about people, but nowadays it's different than it was in those days. And he did quite well, obviously, as a salesman of guns. And so that's where I grew up. My grandfather, my grandmother, and Uncle Robert, I knew a little bit. My grandfather and grandmother, the O'Sullivans, had my dad, Thomas Jefferson O'Sullivan, the second. Then James L. O'Sullivan, who went into the Foreign Service. Very interesting career, very interesting. He was during the war, he was overseas. He was in, not somewhere very far, Martinique, which then of course was a French department. So Vichy France and all of the politics of World War II as they started unfolding. He ended up over in French Guiana for a while, traveled around the world. He went to Italy, he went to China, met Chiang Kai-shek, you know, and all of that. He flew over the hump into Chongqing and all this stuff. Things got, I don't know, organized, disorganized, whatever way they went, and the nationalist Chinese came down to Taiwan. Jim goes on another mission, ends up in Hanoi, where he meets Zhou Enlai, and I don't think he met Diop, he met Zhou Enlai. And, you know, and they told him at that time, why don't you guys back us? This is our country. We don't need the French here. And Jim has told the story, so it was just interesting. They decided not to. We backed the French. In fact, the French army was not even in place, so we deputized the Japanese army that was occupying it for a while until the French could send troops there. Then we followed up after the French lost at Dien Bien Phu and all of that. But anyhow, Jim had a great career. Came back here, oddly enough, and in my book, I wrote a history of our family. This is volume 2. Dad wrote the history of our roots from Ireland coming over to Connecticut. And it's a nice little book, and he did a lot of solid research back in the old days of cut and paste, you know, before any of this kind of technology, and he's out talking to people, and we've got the pages with pictures stuck on with Scotch tape and all of that, and writings, you know, changing things. But I wrote volume 2, and we just got this together last year. And good stories in here of what I call it is the O'Sullivans from Bantry Bay, which is the title that Dad gave it. And I said from Connecticut and beyond, leaves, branches, and flowers along the ways. Because it's really an interesting issue for all of us, for us anyhow, as O'Sullivans. My dad's house, you know, you could shout almost to my grandfather's house up there where he lived with Sis and Robert, you know, when we were growing up. And Jim goes away and then comes back. He ends his days over in Stratford at Oronoque Village. You could look down the road from where he lived, and right across the Housatonic is Orange. He'd been around the world, lived all over the place. He comes back to Orange. Pat, my aunt Sis, golfer, nationally, internationally known, and she always was here. She was always at Racebrook, you know. And Robert had gone away. He had become a geologist and worked out in Colorado. And that was back in the days before airplane, you know, 707s and all this stuff. He could fly across country. So we went and visited him, and Jeff and I took the train around the country in 1964, 65 maybe it was. Dad was still working for the railroad, so we had a pass. You go out west, you know, and they say, what the heck railroad is this? New Haven, what is this thing? You know, and you're on the Santa Fe or the Burlington Quincy, and they said, you know, you sure that's a railroad? You know, but we had a pass, so they let us on. So anyhow, we ended up in Denver and saw Robert, and I was the first ones to visit him since they had moved out after the war. And but you know, the connections are here, and Patrick lives here in Orange, or lived here until very recently. David lives in Orange, still here, you know. And so a lot of the O'Sullivans traveled, but the base was always here, you know.
John, if I can ask
yeah.
you, your family originated in Ireland.
Yeah.
And so what made them come to Connecticut and then virtually to Orange?
Yeah.
You know, Derby, Orange.
Yeah.
What, you know, we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
What draws people in?
Yeah.
Did you have relatives here? Did you have?
No, not really. You know what? Well, they did have the connections up in Boston, and most of them landed. You know, you'd land at the harbors, and for those, you know, in those days, our great-great-grandfather Timothy in 1839 walked from southwest corner of Ireland over to the south central part of Ireland to Queenstown, or Cork is what it's now known as. Ships had carried lumber and food and stuff to Europe and were coming back empty. They were deadheading. So they'd stop at a place like Cork and just take people in, and people would rent space in the hull, in the you know, bunkers down below, and stay there, and depending on how much you paid, where you could get. And so Timothy got on one of those and came to Boston. In those days, you know, and however modern politics are, Democratic Party was strong in a place like Boston, and they'd have guys just waiting at the ships and help people to get themselves organized for a place to stay and a job. And it was rough stuff. They would be working on the piers and the water, you know, breakwaters in the harbors. They moved down the coast after the job, you know, Boston, Newport, they worked, down in Providence. They came on down, somebody came on down to Connecticut. Our grandfather just had the connections up to Canada, great-grandfather, maybe before that, but he went up to Canada and became a medical doctor. But that's, you know, that is different than nowadays, you know. The red stripe on the barber ring, you know, is because, you know, it was just basic stuff. And he came down to Derby, which is Birmingham in those days, as the doctor for the Irish community. And when I grew up, those kinds of communities really still meant something. As if any of you have been to Derby or know the history, there's a Irish church, St. Mary's, up in the main part of Derby. There's the Polish church over in East Derby, St. Michael's. There's the Italian church up in Ansonia. And even the jokes were, you know, you couldn't date a girl, you know, none of this Catholic, Protestant, or black-white stuff. Boy, you get caught dating a Polish girl, an Italian girl, you're in trouble, even in the Catholic communities. So those communities were tight. And he was the doctor, so tight that, for example, while I was doing research on this thing, I had birth certificates and death certificates back for my grandparents, and I looked at the birth certificate for my grandfather on my mother's side, William Hessian, the construction guy who helped build our house. Dang, if it wasn't my great-grandfather on my father's side who was the attending physician and signed the birth certificate. I've got the birth certificate for grandfather Hessian signed by great-grandfather O'Sullivan, Thomas J. O'Sullivan I. And, you know, and so then my father and my mother-to-be, Marjorie Hessian, went to the school at St. Mary's in Derby. Grandfather Patrick was from Derby. He's quite a character. He becomes a Supreme Court judge and all of that stuff. His father died in 1900, and we've got his watch, his pocket watch. And the date on the pocket watch is December 21st, 1899, and it says, "To my darling son, Patrick." And the watch didn't work. You know, it was old. So my wife's brother, Mike, loves to mess with watches. Well, let me see if I can fix it. So he's messing with it. And he's a Jewish guy. My wife's Jewish. So anyhow, or Jewish heritage, not really. But anyhow, Mike says, "This is interesting, this watch. You know, December 21st. Why doesn't it say Merry Christmas? Or December 25th. Why December 21st? And to my darling son." That's an odd thing to put. As it turns out, and you know, as the record shows, Dad's book showed, great-grandfather Thomas J. O'Sullivan had developed cancer, serious cancer, and had tried to get it taken care of in New Haven. They had not been able to help him. Gone to New York. He'd come back in October of 1899. He was a physician. He was the first mayor of Derby, and he was a important figure in the community, but he was dying, and so he bequeathed his watch to his son with that inscription, and then dies early February 1900. Mike also said, "This is an odd pocket watch. It's got a stopwatch button on it, and it's all worn down." And in Dad's book, he mentioned that my great-grandfather had horses and liked to run horses. They, you know, and the local guys, and so the pocket watch, you know, button is all kind of worn down from great-grandpa O'Sullivan. So anyhow, our roots are deep in this area. They came in, and it's very odd. They, for whatever reasons, they were able to come in. They keep jobs. My mother's side continued the tradition of the, you know, stone mason and bricklaying. And so my grandfather goes to Yale, class of '08. He takes the trolley down that road, or probably might even been before the trolley, and they took the train right through here on his way to Yale from Derby. Why did he go to Yale? How did he do that? Well, he's had an in-law who had been to Yale, who was a lawyer up in Waterbury. Maybe that's how it came about. 1908, he graduates from law school, 1911. Again, I mean, just the things we were talking about earlier. He couldn't figure out what he wanted to do after graduating from college. And so, at least at that point, the bishop, I've forgotten his name, Brennan it might be, but anyhow, he suggested to him that he go to the seminary, consider priesthood. So he goes off to St. John's Seminary in Boston. Very short time. He didn't like it. It was not his thing. So he left and ended up back at the law school, graduates 1911. But in any part of my story, I was in the seminary. And I went to St. Thomas Seminary for 6 years, 1958 to 1964, then went to St. John's Seminary in Boston. And I didn't realize it, and I didn't really read that part of my father's book. But we never talked about it, my grandfather and I. We went to the same seminary. Isn't that crazy? And so that's one of the questions, you know, you make your list of questions for the hereafter. I said, man, I got a list for Jesus. This one is for Jesus. This is for the people of this part. This is for a family. This, you know, you got a nice list. We're going to have a good time up there. Straighten out some of these things.
Good luck.
So anyhow, and maybe there are questions left unasked that, are appropriate. But anyhow, that's the connection through Derby. That's the connection. My grandfather was active in local politics. He was elected to Congress in 1923, 24, is that what it was? And it was a Republican district. He got elected and then he only served one term. Whether that was enough for him, I don't know. He had gotten active with Bill Healy, and interested in law. He then had decided to move to Orange and bought that house. Exactly why, I don't know at that point, but they have those three houses. My father ended up going to Hill House, you know, and there was no high school or any of that stuff here. He might have attended a little bit of Orange School. I think he did, because when I went to second grade, Miss Hildreth was the second grade teacher. She said, "You better not," she'd never say this to you, "You better not misbehave. I know I know your tricks. Before you get here and do them, I know them." So anyhow, that was Miss Hildreth,
Yeah,
and Miss Tracy was right behind her. She was the principal in those days. I second that, you know. So anyhow, so I went to Miss Morgan's over when it was at her house opposite the Esso gas station on the Route 34. So I was kindergarten there. Mrs. Tolman was next door, and Jody and Nancy were kind of near me in age, but one above, one below. So we'd go over there, and Miss Tolman had one of those big old station wagons with the wood on the side. I don't know if you ever Mrs. Tolman's car. It was a real woody, you know, before they put on this make-believe wood. So anyhow, and that was kindergarten. Went to school here. One of the things I just remember, and with all due respect to all who went before us, you know, but one of the kids on the bus, I think it was Benny Clark, was a bus driver. There was Mr. Smith, there was Benny Clark, there was Mr. Winkle, Mr. Buckholtz. But anyhow, I think Benny was driving the bus we were on that day, because they'd wander all over town dropping us off. And one of our neighbors, little guy, was kicking up sand, as they say in the South. He just was causing trouble. Benny's driving along. I think we were over on Lambert Road. And he stops the bus. He gets up, puts the brake on, gets up, picks up Kenny by the back of his neck, goes to the back of the bus, opens that emergency door, drops him off, says, "When you learn to ride in a bus, you're welcome to ride on my bus." Closes the door, and off we went. I don't think they'd allow that. I don't know if there's any recording. No, they aren't recording this, right? So no one knows any about these kinds of stories in those days.
But he never acted up after that.
He did not, and nor did anyone else on the bus.
There you go.
We sat there with zipped lips. Yeah, that was funny. But, and then I went off to seminary. I loved living where we live, if you know Orange. Right behind us, we had the most wonderful place in the whole world for kids to grow up at. The Weppawag River comes down on the other underneath the Derby Turnpike. If you walk down there, there's just beautiful waterfalls. There's a rock formation that was our fortress we would climb up on, where that gully is built between the river and where they had the slough bring in the water for that mill that was down there that made Civil War uniform cloth, you know? And that's right, the foundations were kind of there. You could see the stone when we were there. And then it goes on down, and then you had that gem of Camp Cedar Crest. My gosh, what a beautiful place that is. What a beautiful place to grow up. And darn if my next door neighbor, we live in Chapel Hill, my next door neighbor, our house is next to where the fellow who was the horticulturalist for Duke Gardens lived. And he put in 4 or 5 Canadian hemlocks that he could do in those days. It was, you know, the weather was cooler. And they grew, and the smell of a hemlock, I don't know any of you all walked in the, what is that, the nature preserve or whatever you have down there? Yeah. And I think most of the hemlocks are gone. There's diseases and stuff that are getting them. I think they were put in, and I don't know, and somebody else might know this better, but I had heard there was a strike and there was no coal being brought to the Birmingham mills. And so they sent over guys to cut down the big trees that were over there and make that into wood to keep the mill going. And that's why those hemlocks were there. And I don't know if that's true or anything, but anyhow,
Makes sense.
the hemlocks right along the river, and you know, the pond with what was that called? The kiddie end of the water place.
Was the dam there at that time?
Yeah, the dam was built when Robert writes about the dam being built, and it was so interesting, the cement trucks coming in from New Haven and going down Mapledale Road and building the dam. Dad and Jim they'd kind of dam up the Weppawag and made a swimming hole down there that was flooded after the dam was built. Or they'd go down where the railroad bridge was across by Grassy Hill, where the guy used to sell good humor ice cream at the trailer. Do you remember that?
And the American
And so, yeah. And they used to go swimming there, and they had a rope.
Ropes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they remembered that. And growing up and ice skating on the ponds at Racebrook or other places. And playing hockey, oh, such fun, and sledding on the golf course. And one of our first jobs was caddying. It was crazy because my aunt, as it turns out, is one of the best women's golfers that there ever was. I mean, I forget, in this book, I don't know how many tournaments she won. She'd play down in North Carolina. She'd go down to Southern Pines for the winter and work as a desk clerk. And 2 years later, she wins the North-South tournament. She was there with other young ladies who were super golfers. The list is amazing. And she was, do you remember, sis? She was beautiful. She's kind of a short and not a muscular person. But they wouldn't let women play, what was it, Saturday mornings at Racebrook. And my grandfather said, she's going to play with me, and we're going to play right from the men's tee up. I said, oh, yeah, right. And so sis would just get up, look down the fairway, and just fire a ball. She could blast a ball. She was amazing. So I think that's why I didn't really pick up golf. I was kind of scared of it, Can't compete. And but I used to caddy, and caddied for a couple of years before I turned 16, was able to work. That was fun. It was a good learning experience, and got to know the Racebrook Country Club. Really loved it as a caddy. It's such a beautiful place to walk, and appreciate good golf, and to know that I'm not going to be a good golfer, especially at my age. But it was fun, and really there were just it's a heritage for Orange having Racebrook. However, the whole thing gets sorted out. It's a beautiful asset for the town. I mean, you've got Camp Cedar Crest, whatever that becomes and continues. I think it's being used wisely now. And we still joke about it. It's a standard joke in our family about, where you go swimming. I don't know if you remember going swimming in Camp Cedar Crest, but the water was, frigid.
Oh, yeah.
It was always frigid. I think coming down the river and sitting underneath those hemlocks, I don't know what the temperature was, but it was cold. So now the standard thing is, if you could swim in Cedar Crest, you could swim anywhere, except maybe Cape Cod where the water's worse, But anyhow, so we have that. We have the Racebrook going the other way, and it doesn't bring a tear, but as you come over the hill from Orange, going down by Maltby Lakes, and you see New Haven down there, that's really cool.
That's a nice view. It is.
And,
You've had some interesting encounters now that you're moving down south.
Yeah.
You had an interesting story that you shared with us about a particular tractor, I believe?
Oh, yes.
Or a truck driver.
Tommy's story. I was living down in rural Alabama, Macon County. I was teaching at Tuskegee Institute. We went there in 1977. And we had, land was cheap down there. We bought a nice, beautiful southern house in Tuskegee. It had 7 acres of land, so I needed to take care of it. It would grow up if you didn't kind of cut it down. So I bought a old tractor with a bush hog, a 1952 Farmall Super C, for anybody who knows tractors. It was the old kind of real tractor, bright red, and all this. And it ran most of the time. It was a good runner. But sometimes it was temperamental being that age. And fortunately, there was a mechanic in town who was well known, Tommy Story. Tommy Story was class by himself. He was a real good old boy, as they say. But anyhow, a tractor wouldn't work one day, so I called Tommy, and he comes over, and we start talking. He says, "Where are you all from?" And I said, "I'm from Connecticut." He said, "Connecticut?" I used to drive truck up through there. We'd go up to Boston or Portland or pick up a day, whatever it was. The old Boston Post Road. I said, "Oh, yeah. Boston Post Road runs right through my town." He says, "Runs right through your town." Well, he said, one time I got, what was the town you were in? I said, Orange. He said, my God. He says, I got stopped in Orange. He said, there was a cop there. He sat back, he says, what was his name? Peterson. I said, Oscar yeah, was that Peter? Yeah. You guys had a trap. He said, he says there was a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit sign right kind of blocked by a billboard, and there's a cop sitting at the right there. He says, you're driving along, and suddenly, bang, he's supposed to be down to 35. And he says, he nabbed me like that. And he said, he took me to the town judge, the town traffic court. And he said, oh, and I said, oh my God, because my dad was the traffic judge. I said, Lord have mercy, we're in trouble. This guy's not going to do anything for my track. In fact, I'll be lucky if he just leaves, you know. But he didn't try to remember the traffic judge's name. So, hallelujah. He didn't make the connection of Thomas O'Sullivan, who my dad was traffic judge for many years and did all sorts of things with representing the town. But Tommy didn't get that far in his story. So, but it's funny, you know, and you just mentioned that. The other day, I hate to say it, was my first time ever to take a golf lesson. Because I knew I'm not natural, and I knew, being a caddy, you know, you can see a duffer pretty quickly. But anyhow, so Rita and my wife and I decided we're going to do this just for the heck of it. So we go down, we're in North Carolina, and this country club, and we signed up with a pro. Handsome young man comes out, black fellow, and he says, you know, chatting, where are you all from? Oh, I said, I'm Connecticut. Oh, right, good. And I said, oh, I caddied. Oh, yeah? He said, where? Racebrook Country Club. Racebrook, he says. Racebrook. And he goes, Orange, Connecticut, right? I said, yeah. And he said, wait a minute, what's your name? O'Sullivan. Aren't that one of some 9 holes at there? The O'Sullivan, which is named after my Aunt Pat. But he knew it, and here I am, just the first pro I've talked to in 77 years since, what was his name, Joe Sullivan, over here at Racebrook. And he had golfed here as a pro. He's from New York area, had played up around here in Fairfield and places, and so he ended up playing on our course one day. But that brings up another story, because my grandfather was on the Supreme Court of Connecticut. In fact, right at the end, he was Chief Justice, you know, right before he retires. And so he retires, and Governor Ribicoff said, I need some help, Judge Beebe. What's that? I'd like you to be on the parole board. I'd like you to head the parole board for Connecticut. So, you know, Judge just agreed to let me help. So, and by the way, I need help. It's all white board. We need somebody to help us with that. So they're sitting. I said, we'd like to invite Jackie Robinson to be on the board. And he lived in Stamford, Connecticut at that time. So Jackie agreed to be on the parole board with my grandfather. And so they got to know each other, and as it turned out, Jackie liked to play golf. And so my grandfather said, I tell you what, let's go and play golf at Racebrook. And this is what would it have been, 57 or so? Now this is not ordinary protocols in 1957. And so they got my brother Jeff to be the caddy. Jeff was the caddy, and Jeff was caddying, and there was just a threesome. Jackie Robinson, my grandfather, and my aunt Sis. And so they played with Jackie Robinson. He refused to go in through the club. It was just totally, in those days, the protocols just would not allow it. And and if you know, they just walked around the country club on the other side. Jeff got his bag and brought it out of his car, and they went and played. They played, I don't know if they played the full 18 holes. I think they stopped at 14. But as Jackie at that point had a diabetes problem, and so he would carry like a peanut butter sandwich or two to eat as he went along to keep his blood sugars appropriate. So, but Jeff was carrying them and got to talk to him and all of that stuff. So probably the first step of integration of Racebrook country club with my grandfather and my aunt as players in it and making it happen. And fortunately, those days are past us, and we are in a different world in many, many ways. Not exactly where we might want to be, but in a pretty good place. So, yeah, so there's
Some very good memories.
so those are very, yeah.
Excellent. Were you able to, excuse me, participate in any, like the Bicentennial that we had? Were you up for that?
I've been traveling,
ago.
yeah. What was that, 72? Is that right? Yeah.
Right.
I was, let's see, where the heck was I? I was, I left the seminary, I went off to Stanford University in California. And so I ended up graduating in 1968. And it was a challenging time for a young male to graduate from college. But as it turned out, one of my friends, who then became senator from New Mexico, Jeff Bingaman, said that you might not get drafted if you join the Peace Corps. So I joined the Peace Corps in 1968. I ended up in Africa in the Peace Corps, and which turned out very well because the Peace Corps group had a Christmas party in 1968 in a place called Yamoussoukro, Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire. And a young lady who was in the Peace Corps in another part of the country by the name of Rita Goldfarb happened to show up at the party, and we hit it off. We didn't get married immediately, but in 1972 we got married, so our 50th wedding anniversary is coming up. And when we finished in 1970, and then I went off to UCLA, and I got a doctorate in African history, and I studied the French conquest of northern Ivory Coast. So I was in Paris and places looking at military archives and things like that. But then I did interviewing of I did about 120 interviews. We didn't do video stuff, but we did on the little cassettes. And I talked to villagers about what they remembered, same kind of thing you're doing right here. The French army had come into that area in 1908. They'd come in from the north, from Mali. And so there were people, this was 1972, 73, 74. And we'd go back, and I was teaching also in California, so we'd go back and spend a dry season up in the villages talk to the old folks, and heard some fascinating, wonderful, wonderful stories from them of the transformation, what had happened to their villages and their culture, their way of life. Pros and cons. I mean, there was ending of slavery, but there's also a lot of oppression, stuff like that. And then, so in 72, I was occupied with studies and getting married. So here I am I show up for this one, if that's okay, if that's enough, yeah.
Very acceptable.
Yeah.
You guys have any questions? Are you good?
Talk about NC State and agronomist.
Oh, me? My background?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, well, I've had a very diverse background. As I said, spent 8 years in the seminary, decided that wasn't for me. I then went to Stanford, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but when I went to Africa, it totally changed my mind about what's important in terms of human stuff, You really realize that, and you're in a place like that, if you're lucky, you get to meet real people out there quietly and peacefully, and they talk about things that matter to them. And it's so striking that it matters. It's the same as matters to us, being able to bring their kids up and maybe have a little better life than theirs, a little bit of education, medical care. I mean, just basics. And you aren't talking about need. I mean, where I was, you're out there and you have an accident or something, and it wasn't in Ivory Coast, but another country I was in, there was no operating X-ray machine in the whole country. So the Peace Corps said, if you fall off your bicycle and it seems like you got a break, we're going to have to ship you off to Europe to get it checked, even to get it checked. So I mean, but it shows you value of life. People are happy and enjoy life and family and all this stuff. And so that's what got me interested. And then I came back, I got a doctorate in African history, was teaching at Tuskegee, and got involved in working with farmers locally. Same kinds of issues. Farming is a rough job, and making money is super rough on being a farmer. And in the South, Alabama, we had cotton, big fields, big crop, and soy, things like sweet potatoes and things like that were good. And so I started paying attention to growing and money and how to market. And then I went up to North Carolina. I was at North Carolina A&T State University, and I was a professor of farm management and marketing. So I was helping people just kind of look at the cost benefits and then marketing, and work with agronomists and horticulturalists and soil scientists and weed scientists at NC State University. Very amazing program, wonderful people. A&T was a black university. NC State was a white university. So it was A&T is a good school. It's almost 20,000 students now, and a very strong engineering program, one of the biggest ag programs in the United States, and it's black, and it's people interested in veterinary medicine. And so anyhow, I work with farmers across the state, and it was just at the time the tobacco program was being phased out, so that was the base of small farms. You had a tobacco allotment, which was set up during the Depression, so we didn't grow too much tobacco because that was killing the price. Oversupply kills price. So the under Roosevelt and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, they limited production to the acres that you could sell it. I could grow tobacco, I couldn't sell it because on the market, because you had the allotment. And so the people who had the land had the allotment and they could sell tobacco. So that was the base for small farms, and it was ending. It was going to end during the 1980s through 2004. It ends, But the government bought out the intangible asset of the tobacco allotment. So now, what could farmers do? And so it was there we were starting to talk about farmers markets and connecting with local consumers, because small guys can connect and listen. Big farmers, they sell and get good cheap prices, but they sell a lot. And Campbell's Soup runs around trying to say, try this soup, how do you like it? You know what I mean? But at our farmers market, for example, last year we had 58 varieties of tomatoes grown within 25 miles of Carborough. And so we'd have these tasting tests, and we'd have 58 varieties of tomatoes are very, very different little beauties. They're good. Some are good for soup, some are good for salad, some are good on a BLT, and on and on. Some are yellow, some are orange, some are purple, some are red, and just goes on and on. Sweetness, acidity. People don't realize that. And I kind of cry. I know people who put tomatoes in refrigerators. I'm sure nobody in Orange does a foolish thing like that, because that turns a tomato into kind of cardboard. But you leave it out. You can't keep them very long. You got to go to the farmer's market next week. And the flavor is maintained. It's so good. If you're lucky, you get it right fresh in you. Mm-hmm. The farmers tell me, they'd say, oh, we grow a lot of strawberries down there. I say, oh, we sell these, yeah. One of my friends is an ex-tobacco farmer, and he says, I always take the strawberries that I can't sell, they're over the top. Those are the ones with the flavor. He said, I just eat them, or fresh carrots. If you've ever had the good luck to eat a real carrot, so beautiful. And the different colors and things like that. And what you do with the tops, you can put it in your salad, or you can compost it. You can give it back to nature. All those things are fun. And so it was really good experience. Farmers are wonderful, wonderful people, very thoughtful, very wise if they haven't gotten beat up by nature too much. And did some community development work called, we had a program called Community Voices, trying to get people just to work together. And it's so funny. And I don't know anything about Orange. Newcomers come in and go, and people don't get a chance to talk up to each other. If they just talk, and we had this little program, and people would just talk, oh, we'd really like to have a crossing here marked, pedestrians, because we got a library right over. Why don't we have a pedestrian cross? Oh, that's a state road. We can't do that, and so you start saying, maybe we can. What do we got to do to get a crossroad across a state road? All these little communities think, oh, we can't do that. And help them to work together, find out, oh, if you want, that sounds good. But if we work on that, could we work on getting this done, this field over here mowed so that the kids could play soccer? we'll see if we can. Let's see, that's a town program. You know what I mean? How you can get people to, if they work together, then political leaders can understand what needs to be done.
Exactly.
But people don't, and it was so amazing. We were in one little community down in eastern North Carolina, and we gave $10,000. They had an old community center they built like right after the war, and it had run down. It was all covered with vines and stuff. So we got a little group together, and they, and that's what they wanted to do. So, on a Saturday afternoon, you'd see 2 or 3 pickup trucks there, and they'd be clipping the brush, and somebody go, "What the heck are you doing?" "Oh, we're going to open this thing again." Wow. And then before you know it, he's back with his lawnmower. And where they had clipped, now he's mowing the lawn. Mm-hmm. And then somebody else goes, "What you doing?" And they said, "We're doing this for this reason." And they say, before too long, and to get it all, he brings power washer and he's cleaning off the thing. Somebody comes with paint. At the end of it, they came to us and they said, "Here's your money back. We don't need money in this community. We could do it ourselves.
Right.
We had all the resources. Give it to a community that needs it." It's just there were those kind of things, and working with real people out there, gently, listening, not trying to push things over on them, paying attention. "Oh, you're from the university." "Yeah, I am." "Keep talking, just keep talking."
Well, you certainly have had quite a broad experience.
And I
in the
love
world.
Orange. I love to come back.
And you keep coming back.
Yeah, I do. I got brothers. I got to make sure they're doing a good job.
Definitely.
What you need?
How about talking about Gimba?
Kimba. Woo. Yeah, I forgot about her completely. My grandmother. I don't know if you knew her.
No.
But
did
she
not.
was, oh my gosh. Well, Judge was doing his thing and politics and becoming a judge. And she was here at her house, and she just got involved in the community in so many ways. Before the war, she was helping with religious education for the Catholic kids. There were a few of them. They'd have, in those days, they're called CCD, learning the doctrines of the church. As the war started coming up and things like that, she got active in the visiting nurse program and got the connection with Derby and had a visiting nurse put into the Orange Center School. I don't know if you remember that nurse's office.
Sure.
That was right next between the 2nd grade and 3rd grade on the street, front. That was my grandmother's effort, and she got involved in the garden club. She became a president, a secretary of that, both in terms of the beautification efforts, flowers, but also the victory gardens during the war and helping people, stimulating helping people, because during the war, as you watch this war in Ukraine that's presently occurring, you realize what can happen to a country. And for us, fortunately, there was no war here, but all the stuff that was sent for the troops around the world, and things like food were an issue. And then civil defense, here we are, and they were worried about the German submarines coming into the Sound, and they were, and all this stuff, and so they were helping to set up and making sure people had the blackout screens for their curtains for their windows. So she was involved in that, and got to be where, I don't know which town selectman said that she was the most powerful person politically in the town. He said if you did anything, especially in education, without the okay of Mrs. PB, and she was known as Gimba by everybody, we saw a letter that got to her, Gimba, Orange, Connecticut. Johnny the mailman used to live down the road from us on Mapledale. He used to deliver the mail. "Hey, Gimba, I got a letter for you." And that's all it was. It was from a friend, Anna Pepe, I think, sent it with, who was so it was amazing. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. So family's got deep roots and a lot of connections to Orange. So maybe that's why I come back.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we like you coming back. For sure. Definitely. Do you guys have any other questions? Sometimes yes, no?
Well, I guess what's the benefit of a town like Orange and how it takes pride in its agricultural background?
Yeah.
What are some good things about how
That's a darn good question, because as you think about things, it's always about what matters to people. And if you can build a sense of place, which really matters, I mean, what matters is family, and place, and the language they use for both of those. So for me as a religious person, you know, how this fits with bigger things to me. And what do we tell our kids and why, and how do we explain to them why they need to do it this way and not that way. So you got that. But on the agricultural side, you know, you'd always tell the people, if you don't have to buy at a farmer's market, but if you do, you're voting for local agriculture. Does it matter to you to have a pasture with cattle on it, or, you know, our church down there, and we've got a little place to visit in Florida, they have chickens running around, and as I walk into the church, I hear chickens. Think of the connection of big and small, little chickens running around eating seeds, you know? So cattle and animals, open space, carrots that I know that, and I talked to a farmer one day and I said, oh, I hate to tell you, but some of these carrots are going to be eaten by my dogs. My dogs love carrots. He said, you don't have to complain about that. When I'm out harvesting carrots, my dog is following me, and if I find one that's twisted and tight, it's gone. He said, my dog loves carrots too. So all these connections are there in agriculture. And, you know, you start thinking agriculture, I try to get people who go to a place like Chapel Hill, realize organic chemistry, biology. You take a handful of soil and what's going on there, you begin to realize the system of plants, flora, fauna, mycorrhizans with the mushrooms and all of those kinds of, we don't even know how it works, but it works. And so you treat it with respect, hopefully with a sense of our place in it, but also knowing we're getting good food. Right now we've got this avian flu crisis around the country. You know, and you got flocks of sheep that are, of chickens that are 100,000 birds on a farm in a couple of sheds. You start wiping out 100,000 birds, and they're all exactly the same genetically. Science have made them that way. Versus you have herds of chickens, and they might get the avian flu, but you can buy more chicks and start a little flock. You get eggs. You know what they've been fed. You know, and it's not a factory. It's not, chickens aren't eating soybeans. I mean, chickens don't eat soybeans unless you do it. You make it so they do. Just like salmon, farmed salmon. You know what they eat is soybeans. Salmon eating soybeans. What the heck is that about? You know, whereas wild caught or here, the here place. What is the here place that I'm proud of? Is I love the image of it. You know, of orange, the seal. You know, look at the oxen pulling the plow. And, you know, and you say, wow, how far we've come in agriculture. What's that? 1822 versus now. Tractors on our research farms are computer driven, and they're computer run based on the soil and the weed presence that was there last year. That's all in the database. Or you can have farmers walking fields and saying, you know, I got to put a little more fertilizer here, a little less here. I had too much weeds. I got to put this kind of crop here to try to shade out those. That's how it works. Agriculture is beautiful. It's good. It's good for us as human beings. It was a great invention, almost equal to the invention of the hot shower. That person should have a Nobel Prize. Whoever that was, thank you, person.
Right
Okay.
after a hard day in the field.
Or anywhere,
Oh,
or a
God.
cold day like this. I could go take a
Oh,
hot
my
shower.
God. Wow. Well, that was awesome.
Well,
That was
thank you,
awesome.
thank you.
I tell you, I feel like we've been around the world.